Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be starting the first of what are a few advanced PXM development concepts. Now, first off, we're going to start looking at automating some of the design elements within our document. And we're going to look at the authors section, which is at the very end of the document. And the reason we're starting with this one is there are a number of elements within that that can be repeated. So namely the authors themselves. The second is we're looking at this because we're going to use what are known as inlines. And inlines or anchored elements make a lot of sense in flow documents because you start to be able to use relative positioning instead of static positioning. And we're going to start with the simple example before moving on to the complex example of automating the entire document because the principles are the same, but this gives us a nice small set of content to work with and understand. So we're going to first take a look at the document and how that XML is created and prepared, and then we're going to look at automating that through the use of repeaters. So namely, we're going to repeat through all of the authors within the Launch Sitecore site, and then we're going to place elements on the page. We're going to place the author name, we're going to place an abstract about the author, and we're going to place the author image, and we're going to use that using all relative positioning through the use of inlines, and then we're going to add flows to all that, so the more authors that we have, the more pages will be created. And so this is really a good use of all of these concepts before we take that and apply that to the much larger document. So first off, we're going to go back to our source document. Now, one of the things that we'll notice here is that all of this is using static positioning. So for example, if I was to add or remove content from any of these authors here, you'll see that the images do not move in tandem. And this is because these are not linked in any way. We're not using any inlines or anchored frames within this document, and it's a very static document. And again, this is a very common placement technique. You know, an InDesign designer, it doesn't take them that much effort to move this element up as necessary. And in fact, you can see that it would snap that in place, and it's quite easy for them to move. However, if we're automating this, and more importantly, we want to automate this for production down the road, or we want to automate this for fully automated productions, then this document structure needs to be able to change in order to support automation. So we're going to take this and we're going to actually place a few inlines, and we're going to do that manually, and then we're going to drag and drop that to a PXM project to see the underlying XML structure of that, and then we're going to take that and we're going to produce code which will replicate that underlying XML structure in order to fully automate this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this text and cut that, and I'm going to place a new anchored object. I'm going to say insert anchored object, and it's going to give me a few options here, whether this is text or a graphic, and this is text. And what my positioning is, I'm going to use inline positioning, and what my Y offset is, and this basically means it can move it side to side. I'm going to say 0 and say OK. And that at this point, I'm going to insert some of that text. Now you can see that this inline here, it has this little anchor that indicates that it's an inline, otherwise known as an anchored element, and it is basically anchored to this larger text frame. If I move that larger text frame, you'll see that that comes along with that. So I'm going to undo the moving of that back and forth, but what I am going to do is expand the size out so that my inline is the same width as my much larger text frame. That's the first thing that I'm going to do. The second thing that I'm going to do is within that inline, I can further nest another inline, and that is important because I want the image linked to the inline paragraph here of Molly. So I'm going to take this image, once again do Control X. I'm going to go into my inline element, and I'm going to do what I did last time. I'm going to say object, anchored object, insert, and this time here I want a graphic, and the positioning is custom, and this is going to have some offset that I can change after the fact, but I'm going to say OK. and then in there I can place that image. And so now this inline is attached to this one, which is in turn attached to this much larger text frame. And we can worry about all this positioning afterwards. It's actually easier to tweak in Sitecore and your output than it is in the document itself, I find personally, understanding the underlying data structure. But this is important to get to this point. Now what we're going to do is we're going to run through the process of logging into Sitecore and creating a new project to hold this. So I'm going to log into my PXM training, and I will make a new Print Studio project and call it Launch Sitecore Articles. And I will drag and drop that, create a new document, and create a new page. And then I will select all of these elements and drag and drop that to my page. And you can see here that this text frame was created and I have a text item within that. And if I go to Sitecore and log in, you can see that that text item has a whole bunch of XML. And this is really what we're interested in here. And often you can open this in Visual Studio and say, I want to make a new file. I want it to be XML. And this is just really for your understanding of the structure. Now we're not interested in any of these paragraph styles. This is all the text that was statically placed. We're not concerned with that. But what we do want to understand is the paragraph style and inline nesting structure that we have our images. So we can see we have a paragraph style and then an inline within that, and then another paragraph style and another one, and then an inline within that, and then the image element, and then end inline and paragraph style, etc., etc. This is really the nesting structure that is necessary and that our code needs to produce. And so this is a really key concept. If you don't understand how InDesign is placing some elements, or how that is actually structured in the document that you receive from a designer, all you need to do is drag and drop that to Sitecore. PXM will import all of that, and you can look at that static XML and look at that XML structure and understand that underlying XML structure. And more importantly, the nesting within that structure, because this nesting is very important. Our output needs to match that identically, because that is what InDesign is expecting. So first things first, we're going to do a little bit of playing with the XML Element Renderer within Sitecore and within PXM. And the XML Element Renderer is a lovely little bit of code that basically allows you to throw any tags at it and throw any attributes at it, and it will render out XML matching those tags and attributes. And so what we're going to do is build up some of this structure and basically see what that output is on the design. So the first element that we're going to look at here is this paragraph style. And I'm going to use the XML Element Renderer, at least as a start, to render out what we need to see here in this paragraph style. And then we'll do the same for inlines, and we'll do the same for any other information that we're seeing here on this page. And so the nice thing about the XML Element Renderer is that you can reuse that, and you, generally speaking, don't have to do a lot of code to use it. Now, it's a very simple renderer, so often for things that are getting more complex, or if you want to do more interesting things, then you need to do that. You need to build out custom code in these occasional circumstances. But we're going to start by using the XML Element Renderer. So we're going to go to Sitecore, and we're going to create a new item type, or a new template. And so in the same way that we have item types in PXM for all of our elements here, like text frames, image frames, etc., etc., we're going to make a new item type, and that is going to be a paragraph style, and that in turn will use the XML element renderer as its default renderer, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to go into my templates, and I'm actually going to make a new folder within here, and I'll call this custom PXM rendering templates. And I'm going to make a new template, and I'm going to call that paragraph style, and I'm going to put it in my custom PXM rendering templates. Now, of course, I need to inherit from some items, and I also need to use the builder. So I'm going to call this section attributes. And what attributes do we want to have? Well, we want to have this style attribute. And the tag attribute, that's really just necessary for PXM to go back and forth between InDesign and rich text. It is not a requirement, and you can see that if you're looking at the XML schema document within PXM. And so really, we're just going to have an attribute for style, and we're going to save that. Next, I'm going to look at my standard values, and we have this style here, and I could put in body text and pre-populate a number of things. We could have a number of different elements there, but I also want to be able to choose my renderer, and you can see here that I can't in my standard values. So of course we want to go back to our content, and we want to inherit from our Print Studio templates, and we'll go to Publishing Engine and all the way down to Project Settings and InDesign Renderer. So we're going to inherit from that and hit Save. And so now here we can see that we have our renderer, and so I'm going to pick the XML Element Renderer, and I'm going to add the parameter of tag and paragraph style. And what this will do is this will pass that tag of paragraph style to the element renderer, and it will render this content out. Last thing, of course, is give this a lovely icon. So we'll do that. We want to be really clear. We want to pick something that sort of indicates that this is a paragraph style. So word processing tends to have a lot of icons that are useful when we're dealing with XML structures and repeaters and whatnot. So I'm going to pick this and say OK and save that. So now at this point, if I go back to my original Sitecore item here, I'm going to make a copy of this text frame. Call this working text frame, and I'm going to delete that text item, but I'm going to insert my custom paragraph style text frame. And then at this point I can see that I have my tag paragraph style, and I could put in my style equals body text and save that. And if we look at our XML viewer, we'll now see the result. We'll see all the text frame properties that came from our text frame item. And then underneath that, I can see that I have my paragraph style element, and it says paragraph style, body text. Now the Sitecore ID and the name, these are really just used by PXM. They're basically ignored by InDesign. And so the point is that our cases match up. XML is case sensitive. And then that our nesting matches up as well. So we're going to go to the effort of also making a renderer for our inlines, and that you do the same process. You create a new Sitecore item specific for those inlines, and you start nesting that structure, and eventually you end up with a fairly complex structure. You could write a single custom renderer that would do all this for you, but the point of this is for us to understand the elements within this hierarchy and the elements within the structure, and more importantly, the repeating elements within that structure. So we are going to do this by hand. And so we're going to do that for inlines, and we're going to basically build out a structure like this. We'll have a paragraph style, we'll have an inline, that in turn has paragraph styles underneath it, that in turn has inlines, and we'll build all of that out, and we'll build a repeater that will basically iterate through repeating the number of paragraph styles, because this is for one author, Molly. It's her information and her image. We want to do that through all the authors. So we're first going to build out the structure for one author, and then we'll go back and repeat that for a number of authors. So next I'm going to run through creating that inline element and start to build out that structure. And I'm going to skip a lot of that for you. I'm basically just going to show you the end result, and then we'll add that repeater. But we will go through the process of building the repeater because we do need a custom renderer and some code and a compile associated with that. So we've gone ahead and built that structure, and we have those inline elements here. So if we look at our inline, we can see that we have attributes, and we have a number of list values here already in PXM for things like scaling, inline types, object styles, etc., etc. These are references that we can reuse over again. And so what we've done is, again, for the inline, just built a new template type. We've inherited the InDesign renderer, so that allows us to use the XML Element Renderer, and we simply pass a number of attributes to that. Any attribute that we put in here in this list, the contents of that attribute get rendered out as XML elements and XML attributes within those XML elements. And so by using these custom templates combined with the XML element renderer, we can start to build out some structure. So we've done that, and we have now this paragraph style and this inline within that. So if you look at that, we've said, oh, that's a text inline. We've given it a height and a width, and we've said fit frame equals true. So as we add some text, this will expand and push down the next author, which is what we want. And then in turn, we have an inline with height and width of 16, and that's a graphic, and that in turn has an image, and this image is Brandon Royal, and we have this image field here. Now when we render this out into our document, you can see that we have our text frame, and the inline within that is blank, and sure enough our image is also anchored properly, but the image is blank as well, and we're getting a lot of blank stuff. Well, why is that? So if we go back to our working text frame and we look at the XML viewer and we render this out, you can see here that we have our paragraph style body text rendered out. We don't have any text within that, and so this is where we start to run into some of the limitations, is to say, well, as part of this paragraph style, we also want to have some text coming along as well. And so we could easily create a new item type to go and get some text and render this out, or we can make a new paragraph style renderer which will inherit from the XML element renderer. We do want all of this. This is good stuff, but we want to put some additional content into the node. So we're going to do that. We're going to build a custom paragraph style renderer for that, and we'll start to use that going forward instead of the XML element renderer. Secondly, one of the things that we're seeing here is that our image that we placed, we're not getting any content for that, even though we had put a item reference here and an image field. The out-of-the-box image renderer actually goes to the parent element expecting the location to come from the parent. In our case here, it's coming from an inline and the parent is blank. And so we're going to extend inline to pass parent details to that inline as well. And so we can consume that. And then lastly, we'll write a custom renderer to wrap these inlines in, and that's the repeater. And so we're going to repeat through all of our authors to do that. So we're going to do these things one at a time, starting with the simple one, which is the inline. We're going to extend the template in order to add item references. So we're going to add item references, item fields, etc., to our inlines. Now this is something that we also will use in other elements such as repeaters, and so we're going to use this as a base template, and that can be used in many of our other PXM templates, including the repeater. So we'll start with that. So first things first, I'm going to go back to my custom PXM rendering templates here, and I'm going to make a new template, and I'm going to call this data reference. Now within this, I'm going to call this items, and all of the content here, this is actually basically coming from what we already have in some of our templates. If we look at our Print Studio templates for something like snippets, snippets already have this section of items, item references, item selectors, and data keys. The only problem is that this isn't exposed out as a base template, and so I can't just simply grab that base template. I'm basically making a new one on my own, but replicating a lot of what you see here. And so I can easily just take this and copy this, or I can create these by hand. And so I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. I'm going to create it by hand. So I'm going to be back up to my data reference and basically say new item reference. This is a drop tree. Item field is single line text. Item selector is single line text because that's coming from XPath, and the data key is single line text as well. Once again, I will make this, give this a little icon, and then this is something that I can inherit a number of times. So I'm going to use the, let's see here. Sure, I'll use this. And now if I go to my inline and I can say, right, I also want to inherit my data reference. That's fantastic. And so now if I go back to my inline here that has my image, I've got these data reference fields added. So I can then say, oh, let's go back to Brandon Royal, and the item field is image. So I should be able to go back to InDesign now and reload this, and this image should now load successfully because this image renderer here is looking at the parent, which is Brandon Royal. Okay, so when we go back to InDesign and we reload this, you can see that that Brandon Royal image is there, and of course it's got the little anchor because it's an anchored element. So the only thing that we had to do to add that is go up to the snippet as well and add that item reference. So we've got the item reference on the snippet, and we also have the item reference on the image field and the image. Now these are really just temporary so that we can see this content here in InDesign. When we actually put the renderers in place and start to render through, we're going to use a different concept of what we call data keys to allow us to loop through Sitecore content and start to change the context of as we loop through. So we'd start with our authors or the team, which is here, and then as we iterate through, we're going to be seeing the author, which is Brandon Royal. And so this content, again, what we're seeing here is just so that we can see in InDesign that we're validating and seeing that content. And so now so we've done the first step, which is great. We now have our item references correct. We understand that our structure for our inlines is correct. And now we're going to go through and write a custom renderer so that we can actually render out the person's name into the paragraph style, and also other information into what we're seeing here as well. So their name, their description, that's going to render out. And then we're also going to write a repeater, which is going to iterate through all of our authors. And then we're going to tweak the PXM project to insert that repeater into our hierarchy, and then at that point we will have our whole data set complete and 100% automated. So I've added my content here for my new XML Paragraph Style renderer, and it is basically identical to the XML Element Renderer. Indeed, it inherits from that, but it also gives me the ability to pass the item field, and it goes and gets the content based upon that item field. And the reason we're doing that is because if we look back at our project and our hierarchy and what we're rendering out the correct hierarchy. We've got our paragraph style inline, paragraph style inline. That's the structure that we need and that InDesign is expecting. However, after our paragraph style, we actually want some content in this node. And so that data reference that we created and we're using in our inline, we can also use that in our paragraph style as well. So if we go to the content of that, and we can go to our custom rendering templates and add the data reference, that's great. So at this point we could now say, okay, for our paragraph style, we've got an item field. And so we can say, right, for Brandon Royal, the item field that we want is first his title. And so it's good that we confirmed this because it could have been name for that matter. And similarly, we want to be able to get the abstract information as well. And so let's do that. We'll go to our paragraph first here, and our item field is now title. But the other thing that we need to do is change our renderer. And what's the renderer that we're using? And we could change it here, but of course, being clever Sitecore people, let's go back and change that at the standard value. So at that point, we would be using our custom renderer that we, of course, need to add to PXM in order to see that here in this list. So let's go ahead and do that now. So we'll go back to our libraries and our renderers library, and easiest thing again is just to customize or make a copy or duplicate of one of the existing custom ones, because all of this is going to maintain the same except for our actual class. So we'll go to here and say duplicate, and we will call this the paragraph style XML renderer, and of course get that name. And so we now have that renderer that we can use here. Back to our standard values, and we're going to change this to use our paragraph style XML element renderer. And then now if we go back to our paragraph style here and look at the XML viewer, we can see what our output is, and as well ensure that we're seeing the correct content within that. So we'll go up to our snippet and render that out. And so now, and the reason we go up to the snippet, often you need to go to the snippet in order to get your data reference. You can see here I have my paragraph style as I did before, but it is now rendering out the text for that. If I just look at the paragraph style down here and render that out, you'll see it's missing that reference. And so often you need to, when you're using the XML viewer, go up to and preview at the snippet level in order so that you can see those data references correctly. If we go back to InDesign and refresh this and reload this page, you can now see that we have Brandon Royal as text as well. And this stuff is sort of moving around. That's okay because our inlines and all the rest are a little bit incorrect. What's happening is this is rendering out this text into the text frame instead of into the inline. But that's okay. We'll go and clean that up. We'll make sure everything renders correctly. And then next we'll also set the repeater as well. Okay, so at this point we've done a few little fixes here. We've moved that field reference from the top paragraph style to the correct paragraph style here. So we actually have the title field here, and then I've added a new inline for the abstract. So I've gone ahead and done that. And then next, for the inline that's controlling the image, I've moved the X offset a little bit. And so what we now have looks something like this. And you can see here that we've got the P tags that we'd stripped out from most of the article abstracts. So we'll go back and strip that out from Brandon Royal. We'll fix that abstract to be the way that we want it to be. So we'll do that. And then next we can go back to our inlines here and set some styling. So the style here, we can type this in or we can have this referencing a drop-down. But here in our document, we actually do have a style for author name. So I can type in that, and then this is just body text. So I'll go back to this and type in author name, and then for our abstract, call this body text and hit save. And back to InDesign, and we're reloading because we've made changes to these items. So we're refreshing the tree, and then we reload that into the document. So we can now see that we have the correct style for the image, the correct style for the abstract. This is appropriately sized, so this is now pushing this content down, and the image is appropriately aligned to the inline here. So now that we've got this correct for a single author, we're now going to go back to this structure and insert a repeater into this process such that we can now iterate through all of the authors and place all of the authors into this single text frame. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We're going to go back to Sitecore here, and again, first things first, we need to create a custom renderer. And so we'll just make a copy of one of our existing renderers, and we'll call it the repeat XML renderer. Again, the name's not important. This is really just something that users can see within the InDesign connector or within their Sitecore item. The important thing is, however, the class name has to be correct. So we'll go back, insert that class, and so we now have that repeat XML renderer that we can use. Next step is to make a new template and call this XML repeat. And we'll set a few base templates here. So the XML repeater, we also need to reference our InDesign renderer, and we also want to have our data reference because we can pass data to that. So we need to have those data fields as well. So we'll do that, and then we'll also again go to Print Studio Templates, Publishing Engine, all the way down to the bottom to Project Settings and InDesign Renderer. So we'll save that. Also give this a pretty icon. And let's see what we have. And so we'll use that. We'll go to the Builder tab, and then that allows us to click on Options and Standard Values. And then within this, we need to set our XML renderer as our repeat XML renderer. Now what we're going to do is go back to our Launch Sitecore articles here, and we're going to insert this renderer within our hierarchy that we have here. So we have our text frame, and we have the paragraph style within that, and we want to insert this in between, somewhere between our text frame and our inlines. It actually doesn't matter whether we're creating new paragraph styles or not. This is somewhat irrelevant. So I'm going to insert the XML repeat in here, and I'm going to move my inline within that. Now before I do, underneath my repeater, I'm going to add a new snippet. And this is really important. If you're missing snippets, a whole bunch of your code probably won't work. And snippets are super important for a lot of those renderers to have something to grab onto. And so I'm going to call this snippet author. And so I've got my new renderer, I've got my new snippet. Now I can take my inline and pop that in there, and what's going to happen is we're going to create our text frame, we're going to create our paragraphs, and then we're going to start iterating through our authors. And then at this point we're going to start making new inlines and paragraphs and inlines and paragraphs, and that's really what our structure is going to be. Now first things first, for my new snippet here, I'm going to go up to the team item. And so this snippet now becomes my team. And then as I'm repeating through my repeater, I'm going to go and I'm going to select everything in team, and then I'm going to pass that information to my children. So I'm going to say select everything within team that is star, and then my data key within that is going to be author. And then now when I get to the author, I'm going to continue along, and I'm going to be able to get the author from that repeater, and everything will flow from that point down. So if I now go to the XML view here, you should be able to see that I'm iterating through, first off, Brandon Royal, then Casey, then everybody else, then everybody else. And so I'm making sure, first of all, that my repeater's working, but then also that my hierarchy is correct. You know, I may have to move things here and there, but this is first off what I'm seeing from my project. If I go back to InDesign and I refresh this and now load this page again, you will see that that will be repeating and iterating through these. Now I need to set a few things on these fields. I need to be able to make sure that my inline can push, and so we're still going to be using a lot of those jump options that we used before, but the point is this: we are actually seeing the correct references and the repeater is moving as necessary. Everything else is really just tweaking the design and making sure that what lays out on the page is correct. But from a programming perspective, we've got our repeaters, we've got our styles correctly, we're iterating through that content. And so again, to understand the repeater, basically it's using XPath. We're passing an item selector to that. And so we're starting at the team item. Here, we're hitting our repeater, we're going through and finding everything within team, which are all these items. And then we're taking that data key and we're passing that down to the author. Now, later on in our project, we'll get more complex. We're going to go iterate through the launch Sitecore item and then the chapters and then the articles within that. And so you can get much more specific with your repeater and also use a parameter called child data key name. And that allows you to be very specific once you're iterating through content. But still, since we're just iterating through one item here, which is that team item and all the children within that, this is fairly redundant. But the point is this: we've inserted our XML repeater. We have a snippet at top, which is setting the initial value, and then as we repeat, we're using XPath, and then we have the snippet below the repeater, which is essentially catching that XPath as we iterate through it. So those are the really key concepts to repetition and snippets as we're building out these final items.